All right, so we're here for a session called Evaluating Assumptions of Knowledge. We've got three speakers, and as I understand things, you each have a total of 25 minutes, expect about 20 minutes of presentation and 5 minutes of questions, and we'll take questions after each speaker. That was my brief. So first up, we'll have Vincent Auffrey, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto's Institute for the History of Science. Yeah, I never get this right. I'm so sorry. Can you do it? It's fine. Okay, thank you so much. With a paper on religious orders and the emergence of Catholic eugenics in Quebec, 1930 to 1940.
There we go. Perfect. There. All right. So ironically, I decided to do something a little bit different than what I promised to do. And I'm going to start a little bit earlier in 1930. For a simple reason that I've been at this conference for 2 days and learning papers about circulation of knowledge. I was thinking about aspects that have to do with circulation of knowledge at my work in different periods, earlier than 1930. And so what I want to do, I want to start first in 1912, which is the first National Eugenics Congress, and it's the watershed moment in the history of eugenics and its global trajectory. And it plays a very important role in the implementation of eugenics into French-speaking Quebec. The narrative of eugenics in Canada has often portrayed French Canadians as good Catholics who rejected birth control and sterilization, hostile to the emergence of eugenics in North America, especially in the United States and in English-speaking Canada. But we have a very different picture that emerges when we look at different aspects of eugenics in different times. Specifically, in Montreal in 1912, there is the emergence of a French-Canadian eugenics movement that is actually like short-lived. We have physicians mostly who are interested in evolutionary theory. They read French translated versions of Ernst Haeckel's work, and so they get very interested in these issues around not evolutionary theory, but around monism. And when actor in particular, Albert gets almost excommunicated for his advocacy of Darwinism in Quebec, and when the first National Eugenics Congress happens, he sees himself vindicated. And soon we have other thinkers in Quebec around this time who support a very specific version of eugenics based around prenatal health examinations and restrictions on marriages. But that doesn't last very long because the newspaper they are publishing gets blacklisted by the Archbishop. Its director gets exiled to Belgium. And some of its main contributors who write on eugenics, like Albert get excommunicated. And so this budding eugenics movement that, in fall of 1912, they're talking about founding a eugenics society, doesn't really live out the ground in any capacity, except that we have medical journals who are run by very radical physicians who are interested in all kinds of issues, but who take up this issue of eugenics and go internationally to they put papers not only from French sources, but also from sources from America, for example. And you have all of these interesting connections where there are publishing papers that they seek from French eugenics in Paris, from this here, Delfino, who is the only Latin American eugenicist to attend the 1912 Eugenics Congress and becomes the founder of the European Eugenics Society. And so we have this very interesting movement of eugenics outside of the English-speaking world, in French-speaking circles, and that goes actually outside Quebec. That goes all the way to Latin America, all the way to Belgium as well. But that doesn't last very long because the people in person who are involved in this movement are political radicals, and they get, I've been mentioning, portion of them get communicating, and they lose their influence. And I just wanted to start with that because it's paints a very different picture than what we need to hear about eugenics in French-speaking Canada, which is usually this narrative of Quebec being backwater because of the Catholic influence, and especially because of the Catholic hold on everything that has to do with education. And so my work puts into perspective a lot of these issues around the eugenics in Quebec, not only its importation, but also its different manifestations. And this brings me specifically to the issue of Catholic eugenics, which is something that comes up in different Catholic settings in the 1930s, after the publication of the Constitution, the papal encyclical, which criticized gun control, criticized divorce, and it also criticized sterilization. But historians have talked about Catholic community as though it was a wholesale condemnation of eugenics, which, when we look at Catholic texts coming in some Quebec in the 1930s and 40s, we realize that there's actually a lot of nuance to what how local actors interpret this particular encyclical. What the guiding principles of Mississippi, which is this encyclical on marriage, are the following. Marriage is a natural interval, that the family is more sacred than the state, and that purpose of men is not for burden, for time, but for heaven and eternity. So that, the purpose of any kind of Catholic social thought should be to aim for man's salvation and not for any earthly goals. And those ideas on Christian marriage get picked up almost by all Catholics, but we're not going to like that. But specifically by the Franciscans. This is where I start talking about holiness orders. And Franciscans are very important in this story, in part because they have this approach to science and religion that is more conciliatory. And they kind of trace their origins back to Saint Francois d'Assise, Roger Bacon, and so they have this idea of themselves doing science, I think, being very conciliatory. When it comes to issues like eugenics, there are several attempts by Franciscans to try to reconciliate eugenics with the Catholic thought. They're not necessarily unique in the French Canadian context, but I've seen in the French Canadian context. The Franciscans in the 20th century in Quebec are involved in the temperance movement. And they're involved specifically with anti-alcohol preaching. A lot of this, they will absorb ideas from different places, mostly from France, around degeneration theory, and try to preach to French Canadians that alcohol will lead to the degeneration and extinction of the earth. So that's a great part of discourse on alcohol in the early 20th century. But however, by the time we get to the late 1930s, there's a clear shift in priorities. Sort of Franciscans let go of this journal Conférence, and they found a different one called La Famille, as you guess, is a journal that's very interested in promoting family values. It's direct consequence of Catholic discourse on Catholic on Christian marriage. And so they create La Famille as an effort to re-Christianize French Canadian society, as a way also of promoting the ideals of Catholic marriage, families, and is very much inspired by what's happening in a lot of conservative and reactionary political regimes all over, from Italy to Portugal in the 1940s, Vichy France, and except in this context, well, it's also the case in Vichy France and in Portugal. There's this focus on policy that will help the family thrive. We start talking about family allowance, we start talking also about prenatal health examination in a very specific context. La famille, by the time you get to the 1940s, start founding their own institutions. L'Institut Familial, which is founded in 1942, which poses these questions of finding scientific solutions to problems of the modern family, is how we frame it. And so in the early 1940s, there is a scope of publications that are published by the Franciscans and some of their allies in public health, a lot of mental hygienists, for example, psychiatrists, who are writing these journals, La Famille, Nos Enfants, and L'Éducateur, which are invested in teaching French Canadian parents how to properly raise their children. And there's this this tone in their writing of what we're trying to do is to raise healthier babies. We're trying to raise a better generation of French Canadians, which has some what I put it that. It relates to ideas about positive eugenics, even though the actors themselves are a bit iffy about what they're doing, if it's eugenics or not. But in these writings, we find the writings of one Franciscan scholar, Alviblet, gets really interested in this question of eugenics. And I'll have to apologize because I actually put the titles all in French. But he gets very interested in the issues of, for example, prenatal health examinations, writing a number of papers on the topic. And he's really trying to determine if there's any way to reconcile eugenics with Catholic morality. It eventually leads to the publication of a book titled Les Tendances Eugénistes au Canada in 1942, where he presents this kind of what he calls Catholic eugenics, which is this syncretism of Catholic social action with eugenic ideas. He is very clear that he's not all that critical of eugenics. He might be critical of their methods, but he says, not everything is worthy of condemnation in the eugenics movement. That it's commendable, that it's perfectly consonant and adequate to the. I'm not very good at translating on the spot. I'm very sorry. To the moral imperatives of Catholicism, and it's no way to the doctrine. And that even in Castiglione, it is said that we must take into account some form of eugenics, because nowhere in the document does the Pope say that parents who are very likely to create abnormal children should put them into the world. And so he's saying that they don't have any obligation to get married, which is quite a concession in 1940s Quebec, especially in a context where pronatalism is a very important part of discourse, the national discourse. So just to go over Les arguments in Eugenics for Canada, there's this rejection of negative eugenics, especially birth control and sterilization. The issue of prenatal health examinations, he's a little bit more he has a few nuance on the topic. There are a few conditions. He considers, for example, that they are only problematic if they are enforced on individuals and if they are enforced by the state. And so he proposes instead prenatal health examinations that would be completely voluntary, that would not involve any legal repercussions for the bride and groom, and would only involve that the bride and groom would decide whether or not they continue with the wedding if they discover that the other party for example, rare disease or whatever condition that would be that might compromise the stability of marriage or might compromise the health of future generations of children. The argument that Gleb presents in the argument that he presents for Catholic eugenics in his work is that it's based mostly around moral education and moral responsibility. And so he develops this notion that the moral teachings of the Catholic Church around sexuality, for example, are in fact very eugenic. That teaching, for example, people who are not married do not have premarital sex is in fact a great way of stopping the spread of disease. And so it's, to him, he's what's that? He sees it as being beneficial for the quality of future generations. He goes as far as arguing that the Catholic Church has had an historic role in enforcing impediments on marriage, such as impediments on cousin marriages, imposing an age, legal age to get married, requiring consent for marriage, and so having restrictions on marriage that are not beneficial for health of future generations. And that if we let go of the aspects of eugenics, such as sterilization or birth control, we have values that are common between eugenics and Catholic moral teaching, in a way that what he argues, in fact, is that the Catholic Church should play a more important role in the elaboration of eugenic policy. Although the question of policy is a bit iffy because it doesn't consider that the state has any authority in the matter, and that should all come down to the church. This is especially clear in what he has to say about premarital health examinations. Says, he's such an plus and so he makes this argument around education health examinations, saying that them not being mandated by the state, or rather becoming customary, becoming a powerful custom, would have beneficial impact for quality of future generations, and also a tremendous impact on the stability of families, which ties into the idea in the late 1930s and 40s about the promotion of traditional family values. And so they are repurposing eugenic ideas to make an argument for protecting the family from hereditary disease. What's interesting about this work, and Les' work especially, in a perspective of looking at circulating knowledge, is that he credits, he's very knowledgeable about eugenics as it emerges outside of the English-speaking world, and he is reading eugenicists in Italy, in France, and Germany. He's citing works that are written in Latin, Italian, German, French, English. And he has a very broad view of what he understands by eugenics. He has intimate knowledge of a variety of eugenics movement that I say that, like, even historians, it took a long time for historians to look at eugenics and see it as it is outside of the English-speaking world. And so he cites his provincial who's Belgian, have introduced him to the problem of eugenics. And what we see in his work is that he is very much knowledgeable of all kinds of debates happening in Germany around sterilization, in France around the Association des Malades Chrétiens, which is this lay organization that is publishing works after 1930, after Cassie-Kennedy, specifically for promotion of marriage. He's also very much knowledgeable of what's going on in Europe, with the Congress of Catholic position, and also very much interested in the Italian eugenics movement. And so we have this combination of different factors in the way that he looks at eugenics outside of the English-speaking world and what he decides to take in different contexts. And it presents a very different picture than what we're used to when talking about eugenics in Quebec, which we usually see as very backwater or very insular. Whereas we have these authors who are very much interested in international eugenics movement outside of the English-speaking world as well. I noticed that I'm running low on time. That's here, but it's a story that I enjoy. It's really cool. It's an animated reprint. It's been in 1943, around the time of Blaise publication, and it would have been distributed to Catholic thinkers and different families and whatnot. As part of L'École Sociale Populaire, which is this series of pamphlets that are published in Montreal. And this one is annotated, and it's annotated by French legal scholars. As you see, there is French, not but it's commentary on Classique. And this one is especially important because it is a French legal analysis of the issue of criminal health examination. Basically saying that as long as they're not enforced by the state, they are very much government. And this leads, and I want to close on this, to a very important shift in the history of eugenics in Quebec. Is in 1943, there's this declaration by Cardinal Villeneuve and all the bishops and archbishops province who agree that criminal health examinations should be recommended before marriage for every single Catholic. And they start introducing forms for marriage that take into account asking the bride and groom if they had exchanged medical certificates before getting married. And this is a direct consequence in part of Blaise, but it shows an important reversal. Whereas in 1912, 1913, the first eugenicists who almost get excommunicated, well, some of them, for prescribing criminal health examinations. In the span of 30 years, the situation is completely reversed, where we actually have church officials who are officially endorsing criminal health examinations. And this very important change is mostly a result of international circulation of Catholic texts on eugenics that in part go through religious order.
Thanks. Yeah, I have 3 minutes, 2 questions.
Just can you tell me at that time, that earlier period, what followed on being excommunicated? Would someone lose their job in a hospital as a business university or scholar? And could you just say a little bit more about the consideration? Because the outreach is so much about dispensations for quite like second, third, fourth.
Yeah.
Traditionally, which is what was happening.
Yeah.
Replacing generations.
Yeah. When it comes to excommunication, one of the physicians actually complains that it's affecting his practice, and he recants his views. Yeah, with patients. Another physician is announced as being part of local Freemason law, loses his job at the hospital at the Auffrey in Montreal. And so they get into that kind of trouble where it affects their medical practice in very, very serious ways. On the issue of cousin marriages, in those debates, what comes out specifically is that the church doesn't want any legal impediments on marriage, even though they have their own rules, and require dispensation for second cousins and whatnot. Except that they see it as an intrusion of the state into what was traditionally the rights of the church, and they see it as a slippery slope. Is the argument that is mobilized by Catholic critics of those projects.
Make it work.
Being for so long, I'm so happy to see your work. It's just great. I guess my question is kind of twofold. How conscious are they of the anti-Catholic tone of so much American and English Canadian eugenics? That's the first part of it. But the other is function is attempt to define kind of Catholic eugenics. I think all of us, the American and Canadian eugenicists would have thought the essential Mendelian, all the whole Mendelian side of things, and divine sense in terms that are actually you don't really need the notional eugenics for. The Catholic Church is already doing a lot of these kinds of things, the constant community, all those kinds of things you talk about. So why is there a need to call it eugenics in this way? When and to align themselves with some modern kind of ideal like when they're not doing anything that was particularly eugenic by doing this here.
Yeah. Well, the big exception to that is the issue of criminal health examination. That one leads to something very, very concrete. That wasn't the case before. But in Blaise' work, you sense a certain frustration with the more traditional Catholic stance on eugenics, where he says basically both sides are wrong. Is something that he introduces the book with. He says the eugenicists have no sense of morality, and the very traditional Catholics just don't understand what reality is. And so I'd say that the answer to the question is that he is advancing his own version of eugenics because he is convinced that criminal health examinations, for example, would be beneficial for the future of the French Canadian race, or however he wants to frame it. And so, whereas a lot of early historians have looked at Blaise' work and how he's denouncing sterilization, he's denouncing this. Well, at the same time, he's also proposing his own alternatives and saying that the Catholic Church should do these things because he sincerely believes that is beneficial. He's advancing his own. He's advancing his own version of eugenics.
The church not the state that should be involved in this framework.
Yeah. And that's in part to do also with what he has to say about Nazi Germany. Being very critical of fascism and this all-encompassing power of the state, whereas he sees that he has a much more. He sees that the state should be subdued by the church. That the church should impose its own moral code and whatnot.
So somewhere that's
Yeah, it's central. Watch that.
Next up, we have got Matthew Edwards, who is a doctoral candidate.
Yeah.
With the TriUniversity program at the University of Well. And we'll be speaking about out of step or stepping out, tracing the currency of conversion therapy in modern Canada. Another that is
Thank you. I'm just making sure that I'm sharing my PowerPoint. I just wanted to say there were a couple, I've just been informed there were a couple of complaints in the chat that the audio was a little garbled in the last one, so I'll just reposition the mic. Hopefully that works. And that some people couldn't view the. Okay, everybody, can you do your best to let us know if things are not going the way that they are supposed to? I have mucked some things up, it looks like, but if we go to slideshow, and if we hit from the beginning. Okay. Yes, your screen sharing.
Visible text.
But, I'm just gonna make sure, the chat is not getting the slide through.
That's odd.
Well, it's because it's also still longer,
Display settings, perhaps. Swamp. There we go. Duplicate slideshow. Okay. Maybe this will change something.
they can view the PowerPoint screen, but just not the present screen.
Oh, okay. What you need to do?
Well, absolute worst case, if nothing else works, you could just move through the slides and add it present, because that works for me.
We can do that. If I'll just move the window so that everyone can actually see certain stuff. Okay, without further ado, hello everybody. Thank you for coming to the last panels of the day. Pat yourselves on the back. It's been a journey. My name is Matt Edwards. I received a lovely introduction just now, so I won't go too far into who I am and what I'm doing. But today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the history of conversion therapy, and particularly how conversion therapy circulated between medical schools in Canada, how it occupied an institutional place in Canadian medical history. Before we get to that, I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about what conversion therapy actually is. So at its broadest, conversion therapy is essentially any therapeutic practice that it tries to prevent, correct, or change someone to better conform to our ideas concerning the norms of sex, sexuality, and gender. Essentially, it's medicine that tries to make you not queer, to use the most non-complex theoretical terminology I can use. And this has comprised a lot of different techniques across medical history, including incarceration, conditioning programs using things like electroshock or drugs, intimidation, coercion, and violence on the part of parents, doctors, authority figures, or also pharmaceuticals and surgery. I'm a riot at parties. It's a great topic for everyday conversation. But there are two general historiographical positions on conversion therapy and its history. The first of which being that it is a form of inquiry, that it was primarily led by individuals who had some kind of irrational bias or zealotry against US LGBTQ or queer people. And the other explanation for this is that it was a more systemic problem, that it was the product of knowledge-producing institutions, and that the power structures and violence and epistemologies that were in place within those structures created conversion therapy and made it actionable to most people. This is the historiography that I personally prefer, but they can both be valuable in different ways. I've got a bunch of animations, but we're gonna roll with it, gang. Essentially, when it comes to the question of how conversion therapy came to Canada, there are two general explanations in the literature. Once again, the first is the idea that it circulated as part and parcel with other teaching. So medical discoveries and ideas about sex, sexuality, and gender. Conversion therapy was not so much a distinct set of ideas or practices as it was a turning of medical tools towards the project of curing queerness. The other explanation for this is the idea of insulation, that conversion therapy had its gilded age, its heyday, and at some point its practitioners cut themselves off from the rest of the scientific field, ignored all future discoveries and changes, and continued to practice in an anachronistic way. They're both useful, once again, for different purposes, but I find the question of circulation much more in line with our conference, and also an interesting way of looking at not so much explicit or smoking gun moments of conversion therapy, so much as the epistemology and ideas and ontologies that connected it across different practices. So with that said, today we're going to be talking a little bit about conversion therapy circulation in Canadian medical schools. I say Canadian, I mean Central Canada. I'm going to do the Toronto thing where, our world is Canada. No, it's a mistake on my part when I was writing this abstract. I'm going to be focusing on Queens and the University of Toronto, looking at how ideas about sex and gender in the mid-20th century circulated there, how people received, adapted, and interacted with them, and how they influenced the lives of queer people in Canada in general. I also am including some content warnings here because this is a dark topic. There will be some nudity and genitalia. There will be considerations of medical violence, and there will be use of historical terms for intersex people, particularly that are no longer really acceptable. So I am going to include them for accuracy, but please treat yourselves with care. For those of us who are not from Canada, these are the 4 regions that we're going to be kind of considering today. The first is where we're sitting in Halifax, but also Queen's University, which is in Kingston, Toronto, which is just a little bit away along one of the Great Lakes, and then also Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, just in terms of place to contextualize where ideas are circulating to and from, and the people who are in conversation with each other. So what you need to know is that in the mid-20th century, the idea of sex and what we thought we knew about sex was changing rapidly. As genetics, endocrinology, and new scientific explanations and measurements of sexual characteristics emerged, new techniques and new ideas about what sex actually was came with them. One of the major players in this field was the Johns Hopkins Pediatric Endocrinology Clinic, which was a major actor in a lot of the discoveries surrounding sex hormones and their use on intersex conditions, and particularly the medical conditions which often are accompanied by intersex traits like ambiguous genitalia, genetic difference, or other examples. Sandra Etter has written prolifically on this and very convincingly, talking about how doctors working at Hopkins and elsewhere at this time were very concerned about predicting children's future happiness and behavior based off of their bodies. And the work that was being done at Johns Hopkins with intersex children, particularly threw this into doubt because through experience using new hormonal replacement techniques, using drugs like cortisol, which is an adrenal extract, they began to realize that genetics and hormonal levels and genitalia were not good predictors of how a child would identify later in life. And ultimately, the work that was being done here would transform sex and gender within the psychological and medical fields. In terms of how it circulated, it moved through informal paths. You can see here personal contacts, consultations, and research long before it became codified or it entered into medical textbooks. And we know that this happened in Canada because of a man named Dr. Edwin Robertson. Now, Dr. Robertson was the first chair of pediatrics gynecology and obstetrics at Queen's Medical School. He was hired in 1933, and he was remembered as an incredible lecturer. He, at his retirement dinner, students said that he was remembered for his vivid descriptions and his contagious enthusiasm that would stay with them long after they graduated from Queen's. He was considered an incredible teacher, and as a pedagogical resource, he's particularly interesting. But he had a problem very early on in his career: the Second World War, which is a fair problem. The Second World War really influenced the clinical training that was going on at Queen's, and Robertson's solution to this was a wax museum. Now stay with me here. There is he had seen a collection of waxes, anatomical waxes, at Johns Hopkins previously. He hired the same artist to come to Queen's, and then when that artist was too expensive to keep on, he got her to teach a local artist named Marjorie Winslow her techniques. Winslow proceeded to make 2 sets of models. One was a series of anatomical models of different steps in gynecological surgeries, but the other was something called somatotypes. Now, if you are not familiar with constitutional psychology, somatotypes were essentially the age-old practice of trying to classify human minds by looking at their bodies. Somatotypes were considered to be classificatory models that would demonstrate the pathology of someone's body and mind for students. And this was very much the orientation that the Robertson-Wilson somatotypes took. In an oral interview with Marjorie Winslow, which was conducted by the Kinston Museum of Healthcare in 1996, she describes that Robbie, as she refers to him, was simultaneously exacting when it came to making sure that the surgical models were not too pretty or pink, but real, because he was going to use them to replace clinical teaching. But when talking about the somatotypes, which were representing the, holistic bodily deformities, he encouraged her to exaggerate. And he encouraged her to make the pathological qualities of these bodies obvious to his students, which is interesting in itself. So to show you some of these somatotypes, these are then, several of them are intersex conditions like congenital adrenal hyperplasia and Turner syndrome, as well as one that's just labeled hermaphroditism. Now, if my animations were working, we would have a whole process of discovery where I showed you the parts of these that drew my interest and how, but considering how this presentation is taken, I want to point your attention to the one on the far right, which is the normal woman figurine. Now, she looks like a Barbie, and we all can see it, but the thing about this is that each of these intersex somatotypes would be juxtaposed with the normal woman figurine in the course of instruction. And this normal woman figurine is one of the only figures to have a full face of makeup, perfectly coiffed hair, slender hips, and is completely hairless. Now, these somatotypes are also, on the topic of hair, made out of wax and human hair. So they are extremely creepy. And when you walk into an archival room and there's 12 of these things on a table staring back at you, you question your life decisions a little bit. But the other thing to note here is the question of race and racialization. The normal woman figurine is very clearly an idealized white feminine ideal. Idealized ideal. There is also the presence of a braid on the hermaphroditism figurine, which suggests indigeneity potentially. These are also based off of real people. Winslow went to places like the Royal Victoria in Montreal and the Kingston General Hospital and would attend surgeries and consultations with Robertson's colleagues. So these potentially are representations of real patients who we don't have the voices for. We don't know who they are. We don't know where they were encountered or whether they were based off of photographs or real people. The interview is very imprecise about who was a face-to-face encounter and who wasn't. But nominally, these are representations of people with intersex conditions and potentially racialized people who are lost to the distortions of the medical archive. So with that said, the fact that Robertson produced these in a time of having very few resources during the Second World War is interesting, because you could consider intersexuality and intersex conditions to be a extremely minor part of the curriculum. You could think that they were not focused on or they were not considered crucial. But he made these during a time when he was running against the clock. His department was coming apart at the seams, and he tried to replace clinical experience specifically with these. So it suggests at a certain level that he considered these conditions to be crucial to the education of gynecologists at Queen's. And this interest in intersex traits and their treatment, as well as their influence upon the mind and the body, would continue in his later teaching. His lectures during the 1950s have been preserved. And looking through his lecture notes, this quote at the top here was how he referred to cases of women with a mild excess of testosterone. And he described these as the young, unhappy woman who looks every bit a female. Her outward glamour belies the inward presence of the poisonous androgenic essence of the male. She may even mislead herself with periodic ovulatory menstruation. So, in an interesting smoking gun moment for me, he is explicitly connecting the into the excess of the male sex hormone within a woman as an impediment to her happiness. And what is her happiness in this example but reproduction? So the lecture also specifies that using cortisone, which was the therapy that was being pioneered at Johns Hopkins, to reduce virilization and masculinization of the body and reverse sterility specifically, were the therapeutic outcomes that he would advocate through this treatment. Returning to Johns Hopkins briefly, as their work with intersex children continued, eventually the cortisol, which was prohibitively expensive, it was extremely difficult to produce, was eventually synthesized from soybeans, which allowed for mass production and increased access rather. So that also meant that it could be used by a wider variety of clinicians. In the 1950s, you have the creation of something called the Hopkins protocols for intersex case management, based off of the work that was being done at Hopkins, Lawson Wilkins, the Hamptons, and the Hampsons and John Money were involved with the making of these. And essentially, it codified and created a set of standards that proliferated and were integrated quickly into medical curricula. These emphasized firmly assigning one sex or the other once you determine that a child had ambiguous genitalia, choosing the sex that fits the surgical possibilities, and also particularly considering one, that intersex traits are incomplete or abnormal development rather than sexual variation in humans, and two, that gender is the product of the environment, raising, and the mind rather than the result. So these ideas began to circulate through more solid or more easily traceable and formal media like textbooks, journals, and standards at this time, but were not unilaterally accepted either. Which brings us to Fight Night 1959 in Toronto, where the University of Toronto took issue with the Hopkins protocols, saying that they were a perverse fusion of the suffragette cry for equality with the findings of science, while science was providing all of this evidence of the inherent biological differences between the sexes. Now, in terms of this conflict, Johns Hopkins won out single-handedly and told all responsible physicians to disregard the useless findings of the University of Toronto. So, ringing endorsement of Canadian academia there. I'm running low on time, but to relate this to conversion therapy, it is interesting to see that the availability of hormone replacement therapy began to develop an idea of bodily plasticity, which Sandra Eder and Jules Jill Peterson connect to race and racialization. The fact that we could influence bodies using hormones meant that, or prompted rehabilitative programs to ensure conformity to what we consider to be fully developed male or female genitalia, or through male or female identification meant in how they were measured within science. So conformity to these standards was encouraged by this scientific discourse. Finally, the training on these within gynecology, obstetrics, and psychology programs were deeply influenced by these normalizing goals. Moving from the somatotype on the left to the somatotype on the right was implicitly, if not explicitly, the goal of a lot of this training, and shaped the questions that students would ask and the answers that were provided in the context of these classrooms. To connect it beyond just the rehabilitative or the anti-queer product in medicine, however, when we look at training on transgender identity at the University of Toronto in the 60s, we see an ongoing interest in whether or not trans people were born or created by their environment, whether or not genetics or hormones or some kind of bodily explanation led to these feelings and identities later on in life. And to pull from sources like Gender Review, which was a newsletter that was published by trans activists in the 60s and 70s in Canada, they towed the line of this rhetoric to try to get access to gender affirming healthcare at the hands of these clinicians as sexual reassignment surgeries, but also, or gender affirming surgeries and care through hormones became available, but only after places like the Clark Gender Identity Clinic deemed you sufficiently truly trans enough to warrant having them covered by health insurance. So coming back to the question of insulation and circulation, you see a marked interest in controlling who gets to speak within gender identity clinics in the 60s and into the 80s. Rupert Raj, who was a trans activist, very notable here in Canada, mentions that there was an educational workshop that nominally included trans activists and voices at the Clark Gender Identity Clinic in the 80s, but only certain trans people were chosen to speak based off of their credentials and the fact that they were professional peers of the staff there, or that they would conform to the psychomedical status quo of transness at the time. To relate this to conversion therapy today, in 2015, the Pediatric Gender Identity Clinic at CAMH in Toronto, which was started in the 1970s, closed under review for conversion therapy practices. The independent review that was conducted was inconclusive, but specifically disavowed the out-of-step approach and insular culture that had traumatized several of the patients in their own admission. Scholars like Kirsten Williams consider the insulation explanation to be sufficient for tracking these ideas and how they have continued over 50 years of medical practice to haunt us today, calling them, and I like this term, disco sexology because of the 60s and 70s. So to leave you with something, the question of whether or not conversion therapy is over is a moot one. We live with it today, and we continue to deal with it in the policies and practices that seem to resurge in modern Canadian politics with increasing frequency. And Tay Meadow, in studying all of this, notes that the relationship between medicine and science and the epistemology and ontology of gender continues to be characterized by this longing for the certainty of genetics, hormones, and bodily signs of what someone really is in terms of their gender identity. So that's a little messy, but I will end it there. Leave you with this quote from Sandra Eder, and I'd love to answer your questions if you have any.
Yeah, we've got a bunch of minutes.
It was a lot. It's okay. Take a moment.
So that's it. I want to focus on 1959 John Hopkins version DOT battle, because in Scotty, your story was a little clearly again, you can retrenchment into kind of normalizing kind of right? It's very plasticity as a possibility normal rather than learning elements, which is transsexual. It's only a few years later that the first transsexual sexuality clinic is established in John Hopkins and many others follow in the United States. So I assume that from what you said, that happens in Canada, that sign of that movement. So the reason I'm asking is there appears to be a kind of US-Canada split, at least temporarily, more convergence then, because it's also US stuff for convergent therapy develops too. And so there's an internal there. So is that kind of the story you're telling in a very truncated way there?
More or less, yes. Apologies for the division there. It's rushing and trying to bridge disparate times. Essentially what is a question that I have more than an answer at this point, because as people like Ned Shorter have argued, Ned Shorter, biological explanations or biological biopsychiatry, biopsychology remain very popular at the University of Toronto. And there seems to be a real, if not entrenchment and sticking to their guns at that point, at least a consistent interest in it. So as far as plasticity goes, it's I don't know whether they completely reject the Hopkins protocols, but they seem to retool, adapt, and reinterpret them in ways that ultimately do harm, if that answers the question.
One of the things I'm not, think of an overweighting effect on Canadian practices, or its significance and development as a more general national changing position of priority later system.
It's an interesting question. Honestly, I won't be able to tell you that until I finish my dissertation. There's the University of Toronto, once again, Toronto, we think we're the center of the world, is unique in many ways in terms of having a gender identity clinic. Betty Steiner's work there, along with Zucker and the Pediatric Gender Identity Clinic, are rather unique, but there are other gender identity clinics which start in the prairies and elsewhere at the same time. So in terms of comparing them with other practices, that's work I haven't done yet. But it's a fascinating direction to go in. So yeah.
Sorry. Get out of here. Let's continue this conversation. Just because we have a very tight schedule here. So our third and final speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Neswald, speaking from Brock University. And she'll be giving us a paper entitled Circulating Back, the Mirror of Racial Metabolism Studies.
Okay, we're gonna get to see what else can go wrong with the technology. Okay, do you see my slideshow? Yes, no?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, great. Also, if there are questions for me at the end, you're gonna have to get closer to the microphone because I can't hear what's in the room. So we'll start here. In 1924, Elizabeth Croft, a physiology professor at Mount Holyoke College, and Grace McLeod, professor in the Department of Nutrition at Columbia University Teachers College, conducted a series of basal metabolism measurements on 9 female college students from China and Japan who were studying at their institutions. They used a respiration apparatus of the type used at the Carnegie Nutrition Laboratory, and they measured under standard conditions. Francis Gano-Benedict, director of the Carnegie Lab, rode along as a co-author. Now, there's a lot to unpack just in this opening statement. For example, how laboratories at women's colleges were so underfunded that they mainly used their own students as research material, how this research contributed to physiological knowledge of young female bodies, or how these colleges opened up their halls early to students from East Asian countries, already by the late 19th century. There's also Benedict's cultivation of a scientific persona, as demonstrated by his prolific career in co-authorship of anything even remotely connected to his laboratory. Then there is the study itself. It was small and its results were pretty inconsequential, but the question was not. Crofts and McLeod hoped their study of a handful of East Asian students would contribute to resolving a question that had been circulating for much longer. Nutrition physiologists were fascinated by non-European diets and by the apparent ability of people in China, Japan, and India to thrive on much less food than Europeans. Colonial physicians were concerned about the effect of tropical environments on European health and thought about the role that diet might play. So both groups puzzled over whether the differences that they perceived between European and non-European peoples were due to differences in diet, cultural temperament, climate adaptations, or whether there were innate physiological differences between the bodies of different peoples. So this is the question that Croft and McLeod addressed as they measured the basal metabolism of their international students. Most of these students had spent a year or more in a Northeastern American climate, eating the same food as their American peers, and this is in their words, infused with the rush of Western civilization. So assuming these variables were the same for both the East Asian students and the American peers, any average differences in basal metabolism must, according to their reasoning, be due to innate physiological differences. So the paper, The Basal Metabolism of Some Orientals by Crofts, MacLeod, and Benedict was published in 1925 in the American Journal of Physiology. So my talk today looks at what followed from this small study of 9 women at 2 women's colleges. First, the results of the study did not surprise contemporaries. They confirmed what previous studies had shown, that Chinese and Japanese people had a lower average basal metabolism rate than people of European descent. And they fit in well with assumptions about the lower food needs of Asian peoples and their cultural temperament, the so-called Oriental repose, in contrast to the Western high-energy driven achiever type. This study would likely have remained a minor piece among the many contemporary studies asserting that other people were somehow biologically different from us, if not for a particular set of circumstances. So since he began his directorship at the Carnegie Lab in 1906, Benedict had focused on basal metabolism measurement and developing predictive standards in both sexes across the lifespan. His basal metabolism norms were highly regarded and accepted as the universal standard for normal human basal metabolism. His work culminated in an exhaustive collaborative volume with the biometrician J. Arthur Harris from the Carnegie Department for Experimental Evolution, titled A Biometric Study of Basal Metabolism in Man. So this was published in 1918. By 1921, Benedict had filled any remaining gaps. His life work was completed, and he and his lab spent their time and expertise in increasing measurement precision, exploring the effects of small variables, and measuring the metabolism, surface temperature, and internal temperature of snakes, pigeons, and elephants. So I am not kidding about the elephants. So this lack of direction came to the attention of John Campbell Merriam, the president of the Carnegie Institution of Washington. Merriam read Benedict the Riot Act a couple of times and threatened to reduce his funding. In the summer of 1925, in the course of reorganizing the work of the institution, Merriam became even more insistent and encouraged Benedict to develop a new research plan, expand his program, and look for ways to engage with other Carnegie departments. Strongly encouraged. So we come to the aftermath of this paper. So the paper with Crofts and MacLeod came out shortly before Benedict's meeting with Merriam. Shortly after, Merriam was contacted by Alice Ridlicka, curator of the National Museum of the Smithsonian Institution and a leading physical anthropologist. The paper had attracted his attention, and he wanted to discuss how to deepen these investigations. Merriam was a paleontologist, but was also a member of the Galton Institute and supported the Eugenics movement, and already had an interest in the study of human difference. So this was a good fit for Merriam. And for Benedict, his lab was under pressure to broaden its activity. He had just co-published a paper that implied that the basal metabolism norms he had spent his entire career establishing might need revision. And now here was a strong outside interest in pursuing the question further as part of research into human difference. So in this situation, this small study took on a greater significance. Benedict moved quickly, and by the end of the year, he presented Merriam with a plan for a study of the metabolism of races. He pursued these studies until his retirement in 1937, by which time racial metabolism studies had grown into an endeavor that spanned the globe, albeit in a very piecemeal manner. Now, I've spoken at other conferences about how the research was organized and the material conditions that the researchers worked under. So here I'm just going to give a brief presentation of where it traveled before turning to what I will call, for a lack of a better expression, its unruly fringes. Places where it did not function as intended or expected, but it did not do this in different ways. So first, in order to realize the project, Benedict needed cooperation partners on the ground. So Merriam and the Carnegie Institution supported the project, but they were not prepared to increase his budget. So he had limited funding, and that meant that international pursuit of racial metabolism data was ad hoc and opportunistic. The most obvious place to look for collaboration partners was within his own organization. The traveling Carnegie departments provided Benedict with a ready set of potential partners who he expected could be trained up on a respiration apparatus in his lab in a few weeks, and then during their travels would go grab a few locals and do some basal metabolism measurements on the side. Among them were researchers traveling with the SS Carnegie yacht to South America, Department of Archaeology travelers on several trips to the Yucatan, and members of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism traveling to the Magnetic Observatory in Peru. At Miriam's urging, Benedict also trained Morris Stegerda, physical anthropologist at the Carnegie Department of Experimental Evolution, also to do basal metabolism measurements. Now, Stegerda undertook metabolism measurements as part of Charles Davenport's infamous study, Race Crossing in Jamaica, although this was not officially part of Benedict's project, and Benedict also objected to Davenport's conclusions. So the travels of the Carnegie Institution departments were geographically limited and irregular, and metabolism studies were not the focus of any of these trips. Fortunately for Benedict, one of the researchers who visited his lab for training was the physician Herbert G. Earle. And Earle was a professor of medicine at the University of Hong Kong and a member of the Medical Missionary Association Research Committee. So it was Earle who suggested to Benedict that he make use of medical missionary networks in China. Collaborators there included Leslie Kilbourne, whose father had founded the West China Union Medical College, Heinrich Nicholas of Peking Union Medical College, and Hugh Garvin at Mukden Medical College. And all of them did basal metabolism studies of local Chinese populations. Additional missionary connections were with the American University of Beirut and Women's Christian College in Madras, now Chennai. And with the latter, things circle back to the women's colleges. Eleanor Mason was a graduate of Mount Holyoke. When she decided to pursue an advanced degree, her mentor, Abby Turner, suggested Benedict as a supervisor. Although that did not happen, Mason's work was heavily influenced by Benedict's methods and interests. Her thesis and later publications study the basal metabolism of young Indian women and Western women in India, for her students and her colleagues. So in addition to these collaborators with direct connections to Benedict and the nutrition laboratory, there were a number of individuals working at secular universities who did studies on their populations or specific groups within them. Although these studies were within general framework of the racial metabolism questions, connections to Benedict and his lab were uneven, and the motivations of these researchers were more diverse. And this included studies of indigenous populations in Canada, Australia, Mexico, and South America, of general populations in Singapore and the Philippines, and of various groups in Japan. So I don't have time to discuss the experimental setups here, beyond simply that the circumstances were extremely variable and often improvised. Nevertheless, the central studies connected to the nutrition laboratory showed that there was a broad spectrum of individual variability, but once corrected for outliers, Indian, Chinese, and Japanese groups showed lower average metabolism rates than the now so-called American standard of Benedict's lab. A few groups, such as the Mayas and Inuit, had considerably higher rates, and some, such as the Jamaicans, did not significantly differ from the standard at all. All results were ambiguous, and Benedict admitted that the influence of factors such as environment and diet could not be clearly excluded. Nonetheless, there is little doubt among these researchers that racial differences did exist. They were just finding them hard to nail down. So in the last section, I want to look at these unruly fringes of these studies. So Benedict and his laboratory dominated basal metabolism research, and his lab did many of the results calculations for metabolism studies, even when there was no other connection to his lab. So this exerted a great pressure on researchers to agree with the general assumptions that there were innate differences between populations, although most of the groups did not hierarchize. Asking probing questions about the racial metabolism research program in general fell for the most part to reach researchers with more distant connections to Benedict's research network or with much closer connections to the populations they studied. These researchers had no issues with the methods of basal metabolism measurement in general. Their criticism was more fundamental. So they used the same techniques of basal metabolism measurement to highlight where the shortcomings of this research program lay. So I'm going to present the results of a few of these studies, 3 of them. First, challenges. So in the mid-1920s, Hideo Takehira of the Imperial State Institution for Nutrition in Tokyo published 2 essays on the basal metabolism of normal Japanese men and women and the basal metabolism of Japanese laborers. Takehira learned his methods in Benedict's laboratory and used Benedict-designed instruments. And his studies were undertaken in university laboratories with carefully followed protocols. Takehira was unequivocal in his results. So I'll quote, "The basal metabolism is relatively higher in subjects of large body size, in younger persons, and in laborers. The basal metabolism of American subjects is essentially the same as that of the Japanese." A year later, his colleague Shizaburo Okada sought to resolve the discrepancy between Takehira's results and those of Crofts, MacLeod, and Benedict with a second set of laboratory studies, and came to the conclusion that, again, I quote, "The basal metabolism of healthy Japanese is quite like that of Americans and Europeans, and that no racial difference exists." So basal metabolism measurements undertaken under the same experimental conditions and with the same care as those that underlay the American metabolism norms show that there was no significant difference. The conditions for most racial metabolism studies, in contrast, were distinctly substandard. Some took place in open spaces. Often the participants had not fasted, did not return for the second check, or were malnourished. Equipment did not perform well in different climates, etc. The studies were a mess. So Takehira and Okada offered an implicit criticism of the experimental practices of most racial metabolism studies. The second example is Eleanor Mason. So I already discussed Mason's connection to Benedict. In 1931, they published a co-authored paper on the basal metabolism of South Indian women in the Indian Journal of Medical Science. Benedict was the lead author, but it was Mason's dissertation research. Mason's intention was to try to isolate the effect of race and separate it from climate and diet and health by comparing South Indian female college students with Western women who lived in India, and to compare the acclimatization process of both groups when they traveled back and forth to each other's countries. So the study published with Benedict only covered the first part of the project. And unsurprisingly, it found what Benedict was looking for: confirmation that Indian women had very low metabolism rates when compared to the American standard. Privately, however, Mason expressed her discomfort with Benedict's direction. She already had data that she'd shared with him, showing that Western women in India had similarly low metabolism rates, but Benedict ignored it. In her own publications from the 1930s until the 1970s, Mason explored her hypothesis about the connections between basal metabolism rate and climate, coming out strongly on the side of climate. So Mason lived for decades in Chennai and did what her mentors at Mount Holyoke had done. So she studied the physiology of women students and faculty. So in contrast to the other racial metabolism researchers, she didn't just drop by, look at some other people, and go back to whatever else she usually did. So unlike most racial metabolism researchers, Mason was invested in the place and the people that she studied. And the final set of challenges is a paper from 1930 by Mariano Ocampo, Narcisco Cordero, and Isabella Concepcion from the College of Medicine at the University of the Philippines. So the Philippines were a US territory when the medical school opened in 1907, and it was directed by American professors until the mid-1920s. Concepcion is its first Filipino director. Nutrition and public health were at core concerns of the department, and one motivation behind the study of the basal metabolism of university personnel and students was to get a baseline healthy basal metabolism rate for Filipinos for medical and public health purposes. Like Takahiro and Benedict and Mason, they used a Benedict respiration apparatus. Although I have no information about whether any of them had any connections to Benedict's lab. They found that the Filipino basal metabolism rate was lower than the American standard. Like Mason and others, they also brought up the role of climate, but this paper also cut to the core of the racial metabolism program. Their assessment was scathing. I will quote this too. We feel that the inclusion for purposes of scientific discussion of all European and American nationals under the general term white race is not satisfactory. The accepted standards of basal metabolism have been taken from people of Northern Europe and the Northern United States. Likewise, the general full classification of all inhabitants of the Far East under the general term Oriental is not satisfactory. There is a need in this type of scientific discussion of distinguishing different types of white races as well as of Orientals. So basically, they told the racial metabolism researchers that first, they had no clear race concept, and second, that they weren't even able to identify themselves, let alone anyone else. So to close, I've given 3 examples of basal metabolism researchers who turned the methods and questions of the racial metabolism research program around to reflect its failings and deficiencies. So Takahira and the Filipino researchers did not set out to contribute to race-based basal metabolism research. They were measuring basal metabolism rates in their own populations as part of larger public health data collection in 2 countries with widespread undernutrition. Mason needed a dissertation topic in physiology that could be done with a few resources at her college. But all of them felt they had to respond to the racial metabolism research program's assumptions and results. Takahira and Mason were less confrontational than the Filipino researchers, but their conclusions were not less devastating. In sum, the 3 papers point out that the measurements were sloppy, the effect of external variables was suppressed, and the research program did not define its core category. None of this made any difference, of course. Racial metabolism researchers knew there was a difference in the basal metabolism of races, however they were understood, and this knowledge was enough. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And I think we can probably take, 2 or 3 minutes for questions here. And if you come up to the front, maybe that for the sake of audibility, or I'll repeat it if you have trouble hearing.
Here for Elizabeth. The question is that concerns the uses of this work, this body of work in, I guess, what might be called after Coulter, the foreign policy of the calorie kind of question. I mean, how authoritative does this work become, and does it play a role in, I don't know, food distribution policies and that kind of thing? I've seen calculations in, for example, Rockefeller Foundation documents where they're calculating land and calorie needs around the world around 1950. And there's these differential assignment of need in different countries. And for example, the North American one is extremely high and the Indian one is much lower. And there's no explanation of how they come across these numbers. And I'm guessing that this is probably the source. Is that correct, or is there, or does it remain cloistered within physiology?
They did not necessarily need these studies for that. A lot of those a lot of that was done without actual measurement. They would observe the diets and just do it from the diet, because these studies they're quite intensive. Basal metabolism measurements. You need very particular conditions. So I think a lot of the norms for what different peoples needed were done just observationally, like the early US ones were done observationally. And then the further you get into the 20th century, the more they would be done specifically. So works such as Takahira or Ocampo et al., that might flow into then public policy, like the more solid studies. A lot of what was done in the studies for this program, it just did not have the weight. I mean, this was some really bad science that was happening there. It was some of it was very bad. But eventually it did start to more and more. So the further you get into the 20th century, the more actual solid studies would be done by people who were rooted in the countries and would live there and also have their own public health interests.
I think that's a follow-up question in the chat.
Yeah, we can on the chat, yeah, please. Were they responsive to the critiques or were the critical papers just ignored, since the other researchers were quite sure that race differences did exist?
I have not seen a response to that core criticism of Ocampo et al., which is it probably was a little bit embarrassing. They were really scathing. The questions of diet and environment were discussed even within the racial metabolism research program. So I wouldn't say that they were ignored, but I was quite surprised then to see papers that would that claimed that McLeod et al. And Takahira had come to the same results. So a lot of time it was suppressed or misinterpreted. Yeah, so there was a very heavy investment in there being differences, and I remember there's also a general physiology text that cited, I think, all of the studies up until like 1937. There was quite a few. And at the end said, well, we can't really come to any clear conclusions except that there is a difference. So there was just a lot of investment in there being a difference and frustration that they could not quite nail down how to isolate the right factors.
All right, thank you so much. We'll have to wrap it up there just to make sure that people have time to stretch their legs before the last panel. But thank you so much again to all of our speakers.
Thanks. Have a great coffee break, everyone.